Now in this video, I will explain to you some very important concepts related to research that maybe you haven't heard in your life, or maybe you did, but let's clarify them, because this will help you to make your philosophical statement very coherent. Like, I think sometimes we make the mistake of not being coherent in terms of the philosophical stance because we don't really understand this. So hopefully this can be useful for you. So here we have different dimensions on the philosophical stances. We have the positivism and interpretivism, and we are going to analyze each stance from these different dimensions that we also call the philosophical assumptions. So first I will start with the ontological assumption. This ontological assumption or dimension, if you check the definition of ontological, it can be simplified as what is reality? Ontology is the effort to understand what is reality, how is reality constructed. That is the definition of ontology. So the ontological assumption is related to how each paradigm defines what is reality. So in the positivism paradigm, we assume that reality exists independently of anything, right? Like reality doesn't change or stops existing if we interpret it differently. It's just that it's there, right? That's the main thing. And in the interpretivism paradigm is different. Reality is only constructed by interpretations. Of course, we have different levels of how hard these assumptions are. So let's assume that we are just in the two extremes, like in one, reality exists independently of anything, and in the other one, reality is only constructed through interpretations. And then we move to the next step, and this is where sometimes we have a mistake, because the next assumption is the epistemological assumption. So again, the definition of epistemology is what constitutes valid knowledge, or epistemology is like the search to construct valid knowledge. So valid knowledge on the positivism paradigm is only valid if knowledge comes from observable and measurable data that is very objective, right? So this is when the mistakes happen. Sometimes you want to have an interpretivism ontological assumption, and then later you think, if I want to understand interpretations, I want to collect knowledge from observable and objective data. That's when things doesn't make sense. So be careful in there. So if you think that reality exists independently for your research phenomenon, then you build valuable knowledge by or from observable and measurable data that is very objective. That's why it works really well with physics and math and chemistry and biology, because if the assumptions are that laws of nature are in there and we want to discover, we need to use only observable, measurable data. But if we assume the other, if we assume that the reality is constructed through interpretations, like a social process, like a mental process, like a decision-making process, like feelings, then we need to build knowledge based from subjective interpretations from the participants. So if the knowledge comes from subjective interpretations, we are in a good path, right? We are in the right thing. If I want to understand feelings, I want to understand the subjective interpretation of feelings from a participant, okay? So that's second step. Then we move to the axiological assumption, and axiological refers to what is valuable or what is the objective, why do we do this research? So in the positivism, we think and we talk about discovery, prediction, control. These kind of verbs are related to positivism. Again, discovery, that's the keyword. And in interpretivism, it's different. It's about understanding. The objective is to understand the context or to understand processes, right? That's why this research is valuable, because I want to unpack a process. So in that sense, it is interpretivism. Then we later move to rhetorical assumption, and rhetorics means on how we use language to communicate. So what language do we use to communicate on a positivism paradigm? And here we usually use passive voice and third person when you write, because you want to be far from your data, far from the analysis. Remember, in positivism, you want to don't interfere with your experiments. But in interpretivism, you should use active voice and use first person. This is not exactly a rule. I think you will have a lecture on how to write, but it makes even more coherent. Like sometimes when I write a case study, like on interpretivism side, I tend to use more the passive voice, also because my mother language is Spanish, and I think in Spanish we use a lot of passive voice. So kind of my bad in there, but try to follow this guideline to be very consistent, right? So as I said, it's easy to make a mistake. And or not, it's not really a mistake, it's more like being incoherent, and then that confuses the reader. So be careful. And finally, the methodological assumption, and this is where I want to finish my this short video, because if you decide to follow this path, you will end up using quantitative methods, and I will explain what's that in a second. And if you want to, if you agree with all of these assumptions, you end up in qualitative methods. And that's why I say that this lecture is so important and for you, because it will help you to kind of clear this. And you will find like a very coherent, very clear, very easy to understand path. And as I said, all of these assumptions will help you to finally decide on what to use. So it will help you for everything. So it's a very positive thing. Like if you understand this, I think you solve like 50% of the issues that you might have on your research design. So keep in mind this, like try to follow one path, this or this path, and then all the time be conscious that you are choosing on the coherent, or you are coherent on your choices. I don't want to say right or wrong. It's more like, are you really coherent with all your assumptions? Because that's the first thing that your grader or your reader from your thesis is going to check, like if everything is coherent, because otherwise, if it's not coherent, it's not proper research. It's very chaotic and it's not that valid, it's not that relevant if you mix things, like then it doesn't make sense what you are doing, right? Maybe it doesn't sound that critical, but it's very important. Okay, so I think in this next slide we finally have this spectrum of that we can be on the very extreme of one or the other, but we can also be like somewhere around. Like, for example, if we think that reality is a concrete structure, like nothing can affect reality, like reality is there and doesn't matter what you do, reality is there, then you follow this path, right? And it gives you some ideas on what to use in the end, like research methods, like experiments or surveys. But then if you are not that extreme, if you think like it's a concrete process, but it's not a structure, it's a process that is built, but it's still concrete, it's not that subjective. So then you can do something that is still positivism, but it's not that extreme. And then the same on the other side, like if you think like everything is, reality is totally, like here it says, a projection of human imagination, then you have to follow these other assumptions on this path. So the problem is when you choose this and then you move to here and then you end up here. Since that's very weird. So and the other thing is, like, if you assume this, don't think that this assumption is for everything. This assumption is only for your research, right? Like, even if you assume this, like reality is a projection of human imagination, it doesn't mean that everything is that. It means that only what you want to study falls into that. Like maybe you're studying dreams. So dreams is probably 99% a reality of a reality from the projection of human imagination, maybe. I don't know. There is also like chemical things in there that can that can move you to this side, but maybe, I don't know, like, or tales or something like that. Like those are things that are very subjective, but that doesn't mean that everything is totally subjective. It's only your research in that moment. In this case, your thesis. So in the next videos, I will give you examples, like maybe it can help you clarify these things, because it's a huge thing what you are learning in this lecture, and maybe it can help you to understand it better and put it into practice.